I am honored tonight to be able to do the introduction for Katha Pollitt. Many of you may know that Planned Parenthood's been kind of the center of a firestorm lately, both locally here in Utah and nationally. And to be honest, I'm a little beleaguered. A couple of weeks ago, I invited a few friends, I stopped counting around 3,000, for an outdoor chat up at our state house. And I enjoyed having so many friends there supporting reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I thank any of you who were there. I have to say, I'm a little surprised because what we do is good works. We're the people who give you good sex, safe sex, responsible sex, and we do it non-judgmentally. And what hero could we have other than Katha Pollitt to talk to us about non-judgmental reproductive justice? This week has had a lot of highs and lows. The lows would be letters from the state canceling contracts with words like, for no cause. Hey, they were hard to get, but we were expecting them. The highs were Katha Pollitt talking about her new book, which you just received in your gift bag, about reclaiming the high ground in the whole debate on abortion. To listen to her voice of reason, her intelligence, her integrity, and her sense of humor were so inspiring for me to begin this week. And tonight, for me, it'll be like a night at the spa. Okay, I picture myself a woman who enjoys good essays, enjoys good-spirited conversation. I'm going to sit back and hear the provocative musings of a woman whose theme for me this week is to trust women. So important.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I've never been described as a kind of literary masseuse before. It's such a pleasure to be here on behalf of The Nation, the magazine that I've had my literary home in for most of my life, sad to say. My column is, I've been writing it for 20 years. I can't believe it. And before that, I was an editor, and I wrote longer essays. And it's a wonderful, wonderful magazine. And I'm just assuming that I don't have every Nation subscriber in Utah here in this room tonight. I know there are more, but it's wonderful of you to come out for The Nation. And I'm going to tell everybody back in New York about how many people there were here and what a warm welcome I had. So when I'm not writing my column, I'm writing books. And a lot of the times my column is about abortion. In fact, I get emails, I get letters that are addressed to Katha Pollitt, abortion writer. And I'm thinking, oh, come on, I'm so much more than that. But I've written about abortion so much in my column that I decided I would write a full-length book setting out what seemed to me the arguments we've gotten away from in talking about abortion, which is centering abortion back on women. It's about women. It's become so much about the fetus, quote unquote, who is actually usually a fertilized egg or embryo, but now is always referred to as the fetus. And I thought, what's happened to her? Where is she in all of this? So I wrote a book that tried to talk about why is it that it's all about the fetus? How did that happen? And what about women's rights? What about women's rights to self-determination? What about the connection of abortion rights and birth control with the explosion of women's education and women in the workforce, and all the other freedoms and rights that women have that they didn't used to have? Sociologists and demographers who have looked at this say there is just no question that birth control and abortion are a big part of that story. In fact, birth control, well, not so much birth control, but abortion have been part of the story of American women since before the Revolution. People don't know that abortion was legal when George and Martha were founding our fine nation. They don't know that it was legal until after the Civil War, when abortion was outlawed, along with birth control and even information about birth control and, quote, pornography, as part of an anti-feminist, nativist campaign to get white middle-class women to have more children. But it kind of didn't work because in 1800, the typical the fertility rate of American women was 7 children. By 1900, it was 4 children. By 1920, it was more like 3. Except for the 50s, which we think of as the past, as sort of that's what was normal, the 50s. But the 50s was very anomalous, actually. Except for that, women have been controlling their fertility one way or another using abortion and birth control. But in the 19th century, a lot of it was abortion because there wasn't really good birth control. There are some interesting books that you might like to look at about the history of birth control, and the things people did to themselves really don't bear thinking on. It's really very horrible. Anyway, so I wrote this book that tried to lay out all the history and the arguments and what's happening now, and how have we managed to be put so on the defensive in defending women's reproductive rights. So I want to read just a little bit from the book, and I'm going to read from the chapter called Are Women People? This comes after a chapter called What is a Person?, in which I deconstruct the notion of personhood in such a way that you can't really apply it to a fertilized egg. A fertilized egg is not a person, if the term person has any meaning at all. Okay, so are women people? I'll just read a little bit. What if we started with women? After all, they are right here. You do not need to give someone an ultrasound to know that a woman is present. No one doubts that she can think or perceive or suffer pain. What is the moral status of women? How much right to life do women have? How much personhood? What about their souls? Plenty of people think they don't know any women who've had abortions. They are probably wrong about that. The stigma of abortion is so great that women are very careful about whom they tell. The sociologist Sarah Cowan, who studies secret keeping, found that women were much more likely to tell others about their miscarriages than about their abortions. And when they did confide in people about their abortions, they only told ones they thought would not be censorious, who also avoided telling people who would disapprove. That sounds obvious enough, but the implications may not be. Cowan found that abortion opponents underestimate the prevalence of abortion in their community and thereby miss out on personal connections that might make them more tolerant. Even pro-choicers don't necessarily bring their own experiences into abortion conversations. They are too private and too likely to be used against them. I remember a dinner party years ago at which one of the guests rather belligerently announced that he believed abortion was murder. Then he announced that his wife had had one. His wife, the murderer, stared at her coq au vin and said nothing. 20 years later, I'm still wondering, what was she thinking? And why didn't I ask her? I, too, just stared at my plate. It's so much easier to focus on the fetus. It has no personality, no history, no motives to be scrutinized. It demands so little of anyone but the woman who is bearing it. In much of the philosophical debate about abortion, that woman barely exists. Robert George and Christopher Tollefson cleverly cast their book, Embryo, as a brief against stem cell research and in vitro fertilization, although abortion is surely their larger target. They scarcely mention women at all. Even Ronald Dworkin and Lawrence Tribe, whose books support abortion rights, are mainly concerned with the status of the fetus. The circumstances and motives of women who end their pregnancies get only a nod or two. If you start from the fetus, however, it's hard to get back to the women who've had those 55 million abortions since Roe, let alone the ones who had illegal abortions before it and are still doing so in great numbers around the world. You end up debating essentially unresolvable points. If we can all agree that a fetus is a fully formed baby at birth, what about the day before birth? A week before viability, or when it can feel pain, or when it has a heartbeat, or when it's implanted, or at the very moment of conception. For abortion opponents, there is no logical stopping place because fetal development is a continuous process, the unfolding of inherent capacities. Just as, in order to make the fetus visible, the woman's body must be rendered invisible. Think of an ultrasound. You see the embryo, the fetus. You don't see the woman. It looks like it's in a little space capsule. So, just as in order to make the fetus visible, the woman's body must be rendered invisible, so the interests of the fetus, if something that does not think or perceive or have self-awareness can be said to have interests, erase those of the woman. What is graduating from high school or not feeling ready to mother a child, or the very fact that you are living in your car, compared with the existence of this tiny, helpless creature? Abortion becomes a one-sided contest between responsibility and fecklessness, life and lifestyle, innocence and experience, which is to say, innocence versus guilt. No one describes pregnant women as tiny or helpless. They are huge and powerful. They could kill a baby, much less innocent. But fetuses are always innocent, even more innocent than babies, who scream and fuss and are full of needs and rage, like a fiend hid in a cloud, as William Blake put it. And a fetus is way more innocent than a woman, even a rape victim, because what was she doing in that dress, in that place? So let us consider women. Today we're told women can do anything and be anything. Well, maybe not if they're black or Latina or poor, but still. If they don't run the world, as a notorious New York Times Magazine cover story had it, it's because they don't want to. They'd rather opt out of ambitious careers and channel their energies into raising children. But there is an underside to this uplifting story. In order to get anywhere in life, to get a good education, a graduate or professional degree, a job, a better job, a heterosexual American woman today, unless she is a nun, spends around 30 years trying to control her fertility. This is not easy. Every method of birth control has drawbacks. The pill has side effects for some women. The IUD is expensive and can be painful to insert. Condoms require forethought and a willing, skillful partner, and so on. Moreover, every single method has a failure rate, even with perfect use. And perfect use for 30 years is improbable. People are only human. The hassle of birth control is one reason female sterilization is the second most popular method of birth control in the United States. But even sterilization has a failure rate. That's truly amazing, isn't it? I don't understand how that can be, but there it is. Yeah. Okay, there. Okay. Millions of women go through all this month after month. Visits to doctor or clinic, out-of-pocket expenses, side effects, switching methods and pill prescriptions, trips to the pharmacy, keeping track of their cycle, following the news about the latest research, because having a child is such a serious matter, with such a profound effect on every aspect of a woman's life. It is a major physical event and an even bigger emotional and social event. It affects her access to education, her lifelong earnings, all her relationships, and her ability to fulfill her dreams and live the life that she thinks is best for her. But strangely, unwanted or ill-timed pregnancy is something society treats as if it were a small thing, even as pundits and politicians wring their hands over teen pregnancy and single motherhood. When we put up obstacles to reproductive care, the doctor can see you next month, the free clinic is hours away, the pharmacy doesn't stock Plan B, and to the most effective forms of contraception, we are saying it's not so bad to get pregnant when you don't want to be. Or, sure, it's bad, but you should have thought of that before you had sex. What can that mean, except that women's sexuality is what really defines them? Not their brains and gifts and individuality and character, and certainly not their wishes or their ambition or their will. If we allow women's lives to be derailed by a single sperm, if bearing and raising children is something she should be ready to do at any moment, we must not think that women matter too much to begin with. What matters is that they had sex. Judgment about women's sexuality permeate the discussion of abortion, much of which is about trying to distinguish good women from bad ones. Even raped women are suspect. How could we be so sure she was really and truly a victim? Todd Aitken famously thought pregnancy was proof that no legitimate rape had occurred because, we can't let this wonderful line die. The female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. But South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli imagined with some vividness a case in which a rape victim not only got pregnant, but merited a legal abortion. This is a quote from him. A real-life description to me would be a rape victim. Brutally raped, savaged. The girl was a virgin. She was religious. She planned on saving her virginity until she was married. She was brutalized and raped, sodomized as bad as you can possibly make it, and is impregnated. How that happened through sodomy, I can't explain. That girl could be so messed up, physically and psychologically, that carrying that child should very well threaten her life. A pregnant rape victim who wasn't so chaste or so religious, she'll get over it. The obsession with women's virtue infuses the abortion debate, even for some who want it to be legal. Is she promiscuous, on drugs? Does she want an abortion out of genuine hardship? Or is she taking the easy way out? If she were a serious, responsible person, the thinking goes, she wouldn't have gotten pregnant. Haven't these people ever heard of condoms? So, having an abortion becomes an evasion of the responsibility to be prudent and continent. Yet, it is precisely because having a baby determines so much about a woman's life, and because women take responsibilities so seriously that they have abortions. Instead of acknowledging that a woman ending a pregnancy usually has a good sense of what she can offer a child, which is why she didn't get pregnant intentionally in the first place, we do her best to make her feel like a bad person. I'll read a little more. Old school abortion opponents going back to the early days of Christianity lambasted the abortion-seeking woman as selfish and immoral. She knew her own mind all right, and it was full of evil. That view is still easy to find, but the smarter abortion opponents have largely moved away from it. Instead, they promote a paternalistic view of the woman as gullible, impulsive, and childlike. She's coerced by others, is too upset to think straight, doesn't understand what's at stake. That's what the Pope is saying now in his making the year of mercy for abortion, women who've had abortions. But because abortion violates her essential nature as a woman, her mental and emotional health will suffer. And when she realizes that she killed her baby, which may take decades, she will be devastated by sorrow and remorse. So abortion must be restricted and ultimately banned for her own protection. The annual March for Life in Washington, D.C. regularly features tearful women who stand in front of the Supreme Court building and read from laminated cards accounts of their journey from abortion and despair to repentance and redemption through a return to the Catholic Church. While the surface narrative is one of guilt, I killed my baby, I'll never really get over it, the latent one blames others. The drug-dealing boyfriend who pushed her into it, the doctor or friend who told her it's just a clump of cells. Deep down, she never really wanted to do it. How common is abortion regret? Study after study has found that having an abortion is not psychologically harmful. Any sadness it yields is usually transitory. Many women feel only relief. But despite the lack of evidence for it, the myth of widespread abortion regret is powerful. Indeed, in 2007, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy used it in his decision in Gonzalez v. Carhart, which upheld the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. Quote, "It seems unexceptionable to conclude some women come to regret their choice to abort the infant life they once created and sustained." And close quote. And when such a woman discovers the crucial nature of, quote, partial birth abortion, unquote, it is self-evident, quote unquote, that she will feel, quote, grief more anguished and sorrow more profound, unquote. This was, not coincidentally, the first time the court had upheld an abortion restriction that lacked the Roe-mandated exception for the woman's health. A doctor's judgment about what procedure is safest for his patient mattered less than Justice Kennedy's wish to protect some unknown number of women from feelings he imputes to them. Do some women suffer because they wish they had kept their pregnancy? Of course. People make mistakes, sometimes tragic ones. They can also come to believe something was a bad decision when in fact they had no alternative, or would choose the same thing again in the same circumstances. Then, too, if you have an abortion and your life goes wrong afterwards, you can form a causal connection when things were really a lot murkier than that. But why should the sad feelings of some constrain the choices of millions? Why are we even talking about feelings at all in the context of what the law should be? After all, second-guessing, self-blame, and regret are hardly limited to abortion. Who doesn't regret some choices? But nobody would ban marriage because almost half end in divorce. And no one would ban cosmetic surgery because some patients wish they had their old faces back. If it were not so taboo to admit it, we might even find that some women regretted not having abortions. But you won't find the Supreme Court using that possibility to shut down maternity wards. Letting women who regret their abortions stand for all women is another way of saying that women should regret their abortions, because abortion is wrong and against women's nature. So maybe I've read enough from the book to give you a sense of the flavor of it, and I'll just say a few more things. I was on the radio here in Salt Lake City the other day, on an NPR show, Radio West, I think it was, and it was really fascinating to hear the callers who called in, and how the discussion came to be about very late abortions and the Fetal Pain Capable Act, the idea that abortion should be illegal after 20 weeks, well before the fetus is viable, on the theory that fetuses of that, at that stage of development can feel pain. And what was fascinating about that to me is not only that most scientists do say fetuses don't feel pain at that age, but the way the normal, common experience of abortion is sidelined in favor of extreme and fairly rare situations. Most people, I think, don't know that almost 90% of abortions are in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. women try very hard to have abortions as soon as they can. And people who are upset by abortions that take place at 20 weeks or thereafter should be asking themselves, which they never do, why does this happen? This is only like 1.5% of all abortions, but it does happen. Why? Why does it happen? Well, one reason it happens is because something changes. There's a health situation. There's a catastrophic life change. And another reason it happens is because the woman has been unable to get the money together to get to a clinic, which is increasingly an expensive proposition as clinics are shut down. And as states institute longer and longer waiting periods. Here in Utah, I think it's 72 hours. That's 3 days. So that means you have to get to the clinic, get the, requisite thing that starts the process of the 72-hour waiting period. And then what do? Maybe you have to stay in a hotel. What about your children? What about your job? All these things are ways of increasing stress, making it more difficult, and making it a lot more expensive. So people who are upset about late abortions that happen after the first trimester should be asking themselves, what can we do to make it easier for women to have abortions earlier? And the fact that they don't do that shows you that that's not what these restrictions are all about. What they're about is making abortion more difficult at any stage of pregnancy. And they should also be asking themselves, about 50% of pregnancies in America are unplanned. What can we do to make that less common? What can we do to mainstream birth control and good reproductive health care for everyone who needs it? And connect them with health care that keeps them on a method of birth control as long as they want, for as long as they want it, and that suits them, because it can take a while to find the method that's right for you. But they don't do that either. Instead, the same people who want to make abortion harder to get also pretty much want to make birth control harder to get, too. And this is something that I keep trying to sort of pin abortion opponents to the wall with this. And I never succeed. I never succeed because they are redefining methods of birth control as abortifacients. So now the pill is baby pesticide. Emergency contraception is a chemical abortion. The IUD is also like you're having constant abortions if you have an IUD. There's just no way of saying how many abortions you've had. I discuss in the book the way that the way the Southern Baptists are now saying the modern methods of birth control are abortifacients, but the barrier methods are still okay as long as you're married. So in other words, any method from before 1960, the ones that didn't work very well, that's okay. It's when you get into abortion methods birth control methods that really work, that, oh no, you can't have those. I wrote a column where I asked abortion opponents, after the last election where they did very well, unfortunately, I said, okay, you did very well in the election. Now, I have some questions for you. And these were open-ended questions. I tried very hard not to be my usual sarcastic self, just be open-ended. And some of the questions I'm still waiting for good answers to, like, if a woman who gets pregnant can be compelled to have a child, what should be incumbent on the man who caused that pregnancy that would be at all comparable to that? I mean, you can't make him risk his life the way she does, or risk, his health for a serious health compromise, but there should be some way of sort of trying a little bit to equalize this. They never talk about that. They just say, oh, well, there's child support. Well, child support is not at all like pregnancy and childbirth. What were some of the other things I asked them? Well, the whole birth control thing. And what was interesting was, what came out in the answers I got back was a very different conception of sex that probably to most people in this room, sex is part of a relationship, or it's part of a life of some happiness and pleasure, and it's an ongoing kind of a thing. But to the anti-choicers who answered my questions, each act of sex was like a contract to have a baby if you got pregnant. There was, even if you're married. So like every time, okay, all right, are we going to have a baby? Maybe, I don't know, we're trying not to, but if it doesn't work, okay. This is not the way people live. No one lives like this. And yet, when I was on the radio in Minnesota, I debated a Catholic law professor, and she said, the reason there's so much abortion is because people lack self-control. And I said, oh, come on, married people are supposed to have sex. I mean, self-control doesn't really come into it. And she said, oh, married people don't have abortions. So 3 women immediately called the station to say, hey, I'm married. I had an abortion during my marriage. But there is a real difference of almost perception of reality. There are very different worldviews. In one, sex is sort of a good thing, and other, sex is kind of something to be only indulged in tiny doses when you've signed that contract. In one, this is another thing that's fascinating. It looks on the surface like people who oppose abortion value motherhood very highly, and that this is what women are, this is the noblest thing, and it's really great, and how can you turn away from it? I want to put in here that 60% of women who have abortions are already mothers. They know what's going on. And they are having an abortion because they have all the kids they can handle. And our society doesn't make it very easy to handle a family. We do very little for mothers. But the fascinating thing is that on the one hand, the anti-abortion people say, oh, being a mother is just so great. Just once you have that baby, everything's going to be just wonderful. I mean, you'll have struggles, but only for a little bit, and we'll help you. Here's some diapers. Go away. But really what they're saying is if abortion is a matter of convenience, therefore having a baby is only an inconvenience. Now, an inconvenience, what's that? An inconvenience is you don't get to the dry cleaner in time, and you have to go back in the morning to get your clothes. An inconvenience is you get a parking ticket. Having a baby is an enormous event. It's probably the most life-changing and demanding thing most people of either sex do. So when you say, oh, just have a baby, it'll all work out, even if you're 12, or even if you have 10 children, or even if you're going to lose your job, or even if it means you have to drop out of school, what you're really doing is disrespecting motherhood. You're saying anyone can do it. A 12-year-old can do it. Someone who is mentally ill, someone who's on drugs, someone who is totally unwilling to assume this role in life, sure, you can do it. And that, I think, ties and a little bit explains why the anti-abortion movement is so firmly tied to the right wing of the Republican Party. I mean, the Republicans used to be fine on pro-choice issues. They used to be, in fact, a little better than the Democrats. in the 60s and the early 70s. But the parties have been sorting themselves out, as you may have noticed, in ways that have made each of them more ideologically coherent, if you will, but also less able to deal with each other in a rational way. And now you find the anti-abortion movement is politically allied with the conservative elements in the Republican Party, who are the people who cut everything that would help women and children. Everything. There are 21 states that haven't expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. They're all Republican-dominated states. That means there are millions of poor women who are not getting health care, that could be getting health care, that the Republican governors of those states and state legislatures say, no, we don't want to give it to you. Suffer. Cutting food stamps, cutting any kind of benefit that helps poor people and helps poor families. Forget it. So it's like, once you have a baby, you're on your own, doing this thing that is very easy to do, that you wanted to avoid because you're a slut. That's basically what it all boils down to. And it's very, very disturbing to see this extremely important public health measure held hostage to these kinds of misogynistic worldviews. Because before abortion rights or anything else, it is a matter of public health. When women cannot control their fertility, there is tremendous medical suffering. And that is why, that is the main reason why Roe v. Wade was decided, was that doctors were saying, I can't take care of my patients if I can't end a pregnancy when it's necessary. Or I go to the hospital wards and they're full of women who've had illegal, dangerous abortions. And that is the state of affairs that we risk bringing back. You know, when you have increasing numbers of clinics that are closing, when you have 6 or 7 states with only 1 clinic in them, when you have Texas women who are expected now to drive, hours and hours and hours, and some of them aren't citizens, and they have to go through these roadblocks, and it's all very risky for them, you are going to find women ending their pregnancies in other ways, with abortion pills or other methods. This is not a good idea. So I think that, when we look at these, I'll just close with a word about these attacks on Planned Parenthood, because they're really an attack on the public health. Planned Parenthood does wonderful work. It helps women, it helps men, it helps people navigate their sex lives, and it also gives basic gynecological care to women who would have nothing without it. And yet we find the ideologues of anti-abortion are perfectly willing to close that all down. And will say, which is not true, oh, there's plenty of other clinics out there. There are not plenty of other clinics out there. If there were, we would be living in a better America, because everybody would have enough health care, but we don't live in that world. So all these things are connected, the misogyny, the opposition to public health, the hatred of poor people, racism, everything. It's all bound up in the movement against legal abortion and accessible abortion and birth control. So I'm going to close on that very gloomy note and let you have a say. Yeah. In the purple shirt.
Sure. Hi, thank you. So it feels a little bit like we're losing this battle, and I'm wondering if you think it's your book or women talking about abortions that they've had and making personal connections, or what? What's going to help us keep Planned Parenthood funded and get the funding back and not have the government shut down over Planned Parenthood funding and this battle that reoccurs every year? If you can answer that global question, really.
Well, of course you should all read my book, but I don't think my book alone is going to make the difference. Fortunately, it happened that my book came out as I think the pro-choice activist movement is becoming a little more assertive, a little less reactive. So we're seeing a lot of discussion of women talking about their own abortions, which is kind of a new thing. And women being much more upfront and vocal, and also adopting a less reactive language. I mean, this is something that I talk about in the book that disturbs me, is, there's so much stigma around abortion, and the attacks on legal abortion are coming so fast and furiously that it's understandable that the pro-choice movement sometimes adopts a very reactive and defensive and I think at bottom stigmatizing language. So for example, safe, legal, and rare. That puts the accent in the wrong place, because the important thing isn't the number of abortions. The important thing is women getting care. And we don't know what the ideal number of abortions is, I mean, safe, legal, and rare sort of implies that there is some irreducible minimum of abortion that would be good. It would be good to reach that number. And yeah, if everybody had great birth control, abortion would go down. Although anti-abortion people deny that. They think birth control causes abortion. But we can't get into that here. When they come and talk to you, they can tell you all about that. But the truth is, we don't know what the abortion number would be if every poor woman could access abortion. If the Hyde Amendment were overthrown and abortion was covered by Medicaid, we'd have no idea. So I don't like that. I don't like it when people talk like that. And I don't like it when people obsessively talk about rape, incest, life of the mother, because these cases are very important. It's not that they don't happen, they do happen. But if you only talk about that, these very extreme situations, then you're leaving out most women who have abortions for economic, personal, and social reasons. And you're basically saying, okay, if you're a 12-year-old rape victim, you can have your abortion, like the woman that Napoli described, the religious virgin. She gets her abortion, but if you're in school, then too bad for you. If you don't want to be a single mother, too bad for you. If you're living with an abusive man and you don't want to spend the rest of your life with him because you have a child together, too bad for you. Or if you just have the right number of children for you, that becomes like selfish. So I don't like that reactive language, and I much prefer the new language that we're seeing, which is abortion is a normal part of women's reproductive life. When you have 1 in 3 women in America nearly 1 in 3 women will have an abortion by menopause, you can't talk about it as if it's this rare, weird, despicable thing that people do. I mean, do we really believe that 1 in 3 women in America are murderers? We take murder very seriously in this country. We take the murder of infanticide, child murder very seriously. Now we're being asked to see 1 in 3 women as having killed a child. That's really crazy. The same woman who, has children. So I much prefer a more assertive and positive language around abortion, that legal abortion is a good thing. Legal is good for women, it's good for men, it's good for children to be raised when their parents are able to take care of them well. And it's good for society that women get to fulfill some of their dreams and ambitions and use their other gifts. So I'm glad that we're seeing a little turnaround in response to the onslaught of attacks. Yeah. You can, if you'd rather do the questions, that's fine, because it's a little hard for me to see everybody.
Hi. So one thing I found really fascinating about your book and in my personal life is I come from a really progressive liberal area, and I find that the dialogue and language, like you were just talking about, surrounding these issues, even from very progressive, independent, thoughtful women, it comes well, I don't know if I would ever have one, but I support other people's right to do so. And I was just wondering if you think that that has historically been a trend, or if that's kind of emerging recently, or I don't know, I think that's a fascinating topic of conversation.
Well, I think that's the stigma too, that in America, a good thing about America is we do value other people's privacy and other people's decision-making capacities, for the most part. That's a really good thing. And there is that libertarian streak of, I think it's wrong, but, you go ahead. And that's a good thing, too. And that attitude is one of the reasons abortion is still legal. Because people are able to distinguish between what the law should be and what they think they would do or is the right thing to do. These are very different concepts that people confuse sometimes. But, just think about it. A lot of things are legal that aren't so great. So I would say that woman who says, I would never have an abortion, but it's okay for someone else, I wouldn't be too quick to dismiss that point of view, because politically, it's a good thing to have people who feel that way, and don't say, well, I would never have one, so you can't have one. That's the alternative. And maybe that woman never would have an abortion. There are women who have children under very difficult circumstances. And women who don't have abortions because they think it's wrong. That happens. So I think anyone who is for legal abortion, I'm going to give them a big kiss.
It was Radio West you were on earlier
okay.
this week.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In that interview, towards the end, you talked about compromise, and that you thought Roe v. Wade was a compromise.
Yeah.
It was a good one. I don't know if you can, but can you explain what viability means in Roe v. Wade? Does that mean 20th century, first world, medically assisted, non-zero chance of survival? Or does that mean something else? Does it mean a non-zero chance of survival without modern medicine? But in a follow-up, and if it is the medically related thing, explain the logic of that, because I don't really understand the logical connection between banning abortions after that. And the way I think about that is, what if technology invents the artificial womb? So we have an artificial womb right from the get-go, right from the day of conception. Why should that technology affect a woman's right to have an abortion?
Okay, so this is a question about Roe v. Wade and viability. Roe v. Wade divided the pregnancy into 3 trimesters. In the first trimester, which is like up until, it's complicated when they start counting when pregnancy starts, but let's say 12 weeks, you could have an abortion with no restrictions. In the second trimester, there could be restrictions that were based on, which takes us up to 24 weeks. There could be restrictions based on where you could have the abortion, because in 1973, abortion was considered to be kind of more of a medical deal than it now is. And then in the third trimester, after 24 weeks, it could be banned except to preserve the woman's health or life. So then what happened is, and that was a compromise, let me just say, when I say that was the compromise, it was the compromise because it said, you can't have an abortion the day before birth. You can't have an abortion, not that anybody would actually do this, but you do not have an unlimited right to abortion. At a certain point, the fetus gets a vote. The fetus becomes a consideration. And that's a compromise. The woman has some rights, and eventually the fetus has some rights. But the fetus's rights never trump the woman's right to life, as it does in Catholic ideology, for example. So then what happened was that the dividing line became moved to viability from this 24 weeks. And if I'm getting this wrong, somebody tell me. And now there's a question of when viability is. But, viability is not 20 weeks. There are very few fetuses that could survive at 23 weeks. Very few who would flourish if born at that moment. But mostly it's later. So this is all contested, though, because, I get Life News every day in my inbox, and they will have stories like, oh, this 19-week-old fetus, oh, look at this 12-week fetus. And you would think, like, you hardly need the woman at all. Just take it out and, it'll be fine. Which is where the artificial womb comes in. There is no artificial womb. And let me tell you, the artificial womb is a thought experiment, which means people love to think about it. But if there ever were an artificial womb, just imagine what that would be. There would have to be, to take care of the aborted embryos and fetuses of women who have abortions, there would have to be 1 million artificial wombs every year. This is not going to happen. But it would be interesting to know what anti-choice people would propose. Who would they propose would pay for this? Would they pay for it? We are going to have enormous, like in Coma, that movie where they have all those, those corpses in the secret hospital being kept alive for their organs. Would they, build some enormous campus of artificial wombs? No, they would not do this. They don't take care of existing children who need help. They're not going to take care of fetuses either. Another question?
First of all, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here. I just think you're an exciting and interesting writer. I follow your column.
Thank you.
In a culture here that the popular culture that has an insidious oppression towards women, it's just refreshing to see someone who's gotten under the noise and can write really well about these charged issues. So my question to you is, wondering about women as property, the fetus as being owned or managed by the patriarchal culture. If you could find a thread through that, perhaps it's in your book, which I will get. If you could talk a little bit about that and the fear of not having control over property, and that if you can't control women, you can control the fetus as property.
Well, I agree with everything you've said. I think the fundamental thing that goes on in opposition to abortion and birth control is not wanting women to be autonomous, self-directed individuals. However, I will say that there are very patriarchal religions where abortion is regarded more kindly. For example, Judaism. Judaism is a very patriarchal religion, and Jews wrote the Old Testament, and yet, abortion, there is no ban on abortion that is like, oh, you can never have one. In fact, there are obscure passages in the Bible that seem to be saying circumstances under which you could have one. And Jewish law says if it's the woman's life, you have to have one. That's the moral position. She comes first. So I I'm always bewildered when Christian pastors and priests point to the Old Testament that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, because this is not a Jewish idea. In Judaism, you become a person when you're born, and before that you're not a person, and that's just the way it is. When you take your first breath. And I think also in Islam, abortion is they have complicated views under which there are circumstances under which it's okay. So you can be patriarchal without saying women are of no value, or the fetus is the only thing that matters. But nonetheless, I do think it is patriarchal. What we're seeing now is a tremendous. It's a tremendous fear of rapid social change, including changing sexual mores. There are not too many people who think, yeah, go out, have a wild sex life, but if you get pregnant, you have to have a baby. Mostly, people who have contemporary sexual mores are pro-choice. Not entirely, not always, but sort of. And it's the people who want to put women back in the home, in the family, in marriage, confine sex to marriage. That's where you find the truly powerful part of the anti-choice movement and message. And I'll just say one more thing, which is, people say, why is it that in America we have this anti-choice movement, and in Europe they don't have one? Although they're getting one as the American anti-choice movement is exporting itself and its methods to other countries. But the big difference is we are much more religious than Europe is. There are just many. Our church is our Catholic Church is very powerful, and our evangelical Protestant church is very powerful, and our Mormon church is very powerful, and they are very tied in with politics in a way that is far less true in most European countries. And I think that is that kind of patriarchal worldview that drives the anti-choice movement, which isn't to say that every person who is anti-choice is religious, but that's where the social organization and the money come from. And money is important, as you know. So maybe one more question. I don't know when we're supposed to stop.
Hi, I come from an Italian Catholic family. So my mom had 6 kids, and we were all spaced 2 years apart, except for me, I'm number 5, and my youngest sister, who were 4 years apart. It came up somehow that in between there, she was pregnant and she had an abortion. Mm-hmm. I mean, she never came out and told me she did, but I know that she did. I'm just curious, it was 1957. What would she have done to get an abortion back then?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I begin the book by talking about my mother's abortion, which was in 1960 and was illegal. It's a little hard to think back then. There was a wide variety of experiences. Your mother might have gone to a doctor. A lot of doctors performed abortions after hours. Or she might have been blindfolded in a parking lot and driven to a motel room for some person who barely knew what they were doing. There was a lot of illegal abortion. I think it was 1960, Mary Calderon, who was then the medical director of Planned Parenthood, convened a conference of demographers and doctors and medical researchers to talk about illegal abortion. And it was a big question, well, how much illegal abortion is there? It's very hard to know because it was illegal. People don't then wave their hand and say, oh, yes, I did this. But the most common number that was put forward at this conference was $1 million a year. Now, when you think how much smaller the population of the United States was then, and also that families were larger then, that tells you how common abortion was. It was much more common than it is now. And even today, we find there are many countries where the abortion rate, where abortion is illegal, but the rate of abortion is higher than in this country. In many third world countries, for example, like Brazil, many Latin American countries. There's a huge amount of illegal abortion in Latin America, which the Pope should pay a little more attention to since he's Argentinian. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah, one more.
So I think you were very funny, and I did not anticipate laughing over reproductive rights. In fact, often I find myself getting angry a lot of the time. And so I was hoping you might speak to the role of humor in your writing, and how do you find that using humor helps create conversation instead of fear and anger?
Well, that's a really good question. I try to write everything I write in a way that is fun for me. And humor is part of the way I entertain myself and entertain others too, I hope a little bit sometimes. And I think sometimes, you know, if I were to write a Jeremiah against abortion restrictions in my column every other week when I write my column, it would be unbearable. You have to bring some life and some personhood and personality and fun to what you write, or you can't really keep doing it, and nobody would want to read it anyway. So I guess that's my best answer. It's just part of what my style is, and I'm glad you think it's funny. I'm sure not everybody does. Anyway, I think we've run out of time. So thank you so much, Nation readers.